Meet Rob Ward, an actor, choreographer, and writer who has worked in the Twin Cities theater community since 2013.
In addition to having recently written a book of poetry, Rob used his skills to channel the turbulent circumstances of the pandemic into an inventive science fiction novel called Click.
Welcome to Scratch, Claw, Push, a podcast about artists clawing out a place for themselves in the world. I'm Billy Jo Combs.
And I'm Brandon Duke. Let's go. Well, welcome to the show, Mr. Rob Ward.
Glad to be here.
So at the outset, I don't know if Billy has briefed you beforehand.
No.
But we like to kick off the show with a thing we call the 60-second intro. Think about it like blackjack. You got 60 seconds to tell us who you are and what you do, and then after that, we're going to deep dive. So, Billy, would you like to run the clock this morning?
I'm all set. Are you ready, Rob?
Ready?
Okay, and go.
Hi, I'm Rob Ward. I am a Chicago-born artist now living in Minnesota. I have primarily done theater, but I've also been in TV, short films, music videos. I have also written a book called Click. That is a science fiction novel at the moment. I have also just released a book of poetry. Talk about the clock. Yes, Apex of Christmas Strife, that's what it's called. I've also been touring. I am also planning on touring a fringe show I wrote called How to Kill a Horse, which is a true story. And, well, I mean, that's, those are the big highlights. I mean, getting into detail in 60 seconds. You know
All
what?
right.
I'm just going to call it there.
You have 5 seconds left at the end there. Good
I
job.
yield
All
my
right.
time.
Good. Well done. Well done. I mean, yeah, it's like, that's the trick with that thing is you can't overthink it.
Mhm.
Because once you start doing that, you're toast.
Right.
So,
Well, yeah,
Billy,
I asked Rob to join us because we've been good friends since we did a show together. I don't know if it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe even.
Probably 7.
And you know, Rob's just a good guy, and I admire people who are, you know, doing other creative things other than their main thing, because I feel like all of us get in this place where we, you know, you can be too much in your own little world, I think, and like seeking arts outside of your art can sometimes help inform that in a different way. I mean, Rob, how did you end up going from theater to writing?
Well, it took place during the pandemic, as a lot of things kind of happened. I've always had an inkling for this book idea in my head ever since I was a kid. But COVID, really, when we were all locked up together, I started one of my big hobbies. I like to do RPGs. I like to do tabletop role-playing games. And sometimes I really miss the pandemic because that was the one time you were able to sit down on your computer with a whole bunch of other people and you could run a campaign that went for 6, 9 months and it'll be fine. And no one can really cancel because what else in life is going to pop up? So I had an idea for something like that, and I started to I ran a bit of a setting. The world is I use that setting in a game, just kind of a one-time game, and it went well. It really went well. And then I started, pardon?
No, so like for the people who may not be familiar with your book, give us like the basic premise of it.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So the year is 2223, sorry. Mankind is extinct, and the world is inhabited by these animal-human hybrids called gybrids. Gybrids are essentially engineered super soldiers from way back in the day that have come to inherit the earth. And with that inheritance, there's all these different the political layout and the cultural layout of the world is much different than what it is today. And my book follows a smuggler named Naya Rudo. She is a Poescari. She is a bat-human hybrid. And she's on a smuggling run into a war-torn Florida. So in this book, Florida is actually a little bit better than it is today. Despite
the Democratic Republic of Florida.
The Democratic Republic of Florida, that is right. Yeah, and there's all these factions that are fighting this massive civil war over it. So I was told by a friend of mine, Tim Niederreiter, he's an author. He said, look, you got an idea here. Why not just write a book? I'm like, well, I never really done it before, but okay. So I just gave it a shot. And as I started writing, I really leaned on people like Tim and my wife, Natalie, a good friend of mine, McClelland. They're my alpha readers. I would bring them portions and be like, hey, how does this work? What's the feedback? Because I didn't really know what I was doing. And so it was it was fascinating because once I got to a certain point, I didn't even know where I was going with the story. I'm what you call in the writing circles a pantser, because you got planners and then you got pantsers. Planners have everything lined up where they want to go. Pantsers just go by the seat of their pants. And I didn't even realize I was done until I hit this one point and I said, yeah, this is done. We're done here. This is where we're stopping. And
save some of that for the sequel.
Exactly, yes. Now I just got to get my ass in gear and write a sequel.
Well,
I would love to read a prequel.
A prequel?
Yeah, I saw some comments because I was in leading up to the show, I was looking at some of the stuff on Amazon. Someone was like, "We're going to need a prequel and a sequel," and unfortunately, I didn't get to finish the book before we got on. I'm still kind of like in the early stages of it, but it is just the premise alone is fascinating, and I'm like a few pages into it, and I'm like, this is some wild stuff. In the best way, because it's like starts off the Democratic Republic of Florida. I'm like, oh boy, here we go.
So, Rob, you said you had this idea since childhood, but were there any things along the way that inspired you in writing this story?
Yeah. Something that really kind of hit with something that's always fascinated me as a creative has been, well, in addition to crime, because I'm a huge organized crime nerd. Another thing that has always been with me since childhood. I've always been very interested in factionalism and different entities striving for their own goals, striving for their own agendas. And I really wanted to kind of explore that in Click. One of the biggest things that trying to wrap my head around it was the Second Congo War. And there were some various wars in Africa that really hit a creative spot in my head where it's like, okay, you have all these different factions really striving for control, all these different warlords, and they all have either like ethnic or religious or political or all three, and they're working against the same people but also against each other. It's very convoluted, and I wanted to explore that in this book in a way that could make it make sense. Break it down to its base levels and study that. But I didn't want to just come in like full blown, like, okay, here's this fictional war with all these fictional factions. No, we need someone on the ground there. And
it's kind of taking like the original Star Wars approach, which is kind of what I liked about it. Like you just kind of drop everybody in it, and then you kind of explain it as you go. You've set out this. Okay, the main character has this particular goal. They're in this setting, and then you kind of bring in the information around it as you go, which it kind of has like a nice flow to it, where it's like you can, based on my, from what I've read, like you can follow along this main character, and you're getting these little details as you go, and then the world kind of, and it's kind of like you're opening the aperture, on the world as, you get deeper and deeper into the story.
Mm-hmm. And that's something I definitely wanted to do, because the problem I have with some sci-fi is they try to just push all the techno gear and the big star system stuff on everyone right away, and I don't like that. But yeah, also another thing was just really the big thing about Naya, that character, my main character, the smuggler. I definitely wanted to explore trauma through her, and I wanted to explore one's morality. Where is that line? Because she's in her 30s. She's very introverted. She's got PTSD. And she's still doing all this stuff for money. And it's a very morally gray area. It's not even that gray. Let's say there's definitely, it's leaning towards a darker shade of gray.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to explore like getting into a mindset of someone that's doing tangential terrible things when you're surrounded by other terrible things.
Surrounded by like more terrible things. Like,
oh yeah,
she's maybe the least of, in this world, she's like maybe the, one of the lesser offenders.
Yeah, she's not one of those committing genocide right now.
Right.
She's not great. The things she's doing are not great, but again, in a world where people are committing genocide and bombing people, she's kind of lower on the list. Lower priority.
A weird thought that popped into my head, like how much of this was like inspired by like some of the old acting exercises where you have to like, channel like a certain animal, like, okay, now you're a seal, or now you're a bat, or a rhino, or it's like,
yeah, I definitely used a lot of that. And I've definitely, there's around somewhere I have all these sketchings of what each one of those gibberids look like. What do Nurians and Zurians look like? Cattle people and pig people, and like how they hold their weight, how they how tall would they be? Where do they hold tension in their body?
Yeah, because one of the things you did up front, you were just saying, like, you were describing like how tall they were, but you were doing it in centimeters, so I had to go look it up and realize, okay, so one of our characters is like less than 5 feet tall and is standing next to someone who is over 8 feet tall. So I was like, okay, so we've already kind of thrown down. It's one of those like little details you dole out early on.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a clue as to like, this is how it's like, you're talking about the factionalism and like one of the things that's interesting, and maybe, I don't know if it was like, this was inspired by just the political landscape, not to dig into that, but just what we see nowadays where it's not even like the old, left versus right anymore. It feels like it's gotten even more granular, where now you see all different factions on both sides kind of like sniping at each other. And that's kind of what it got. Like it's like now, I think with the internet, that like now people can go cloister off into even like smaller, more concentrated groups. And now you see where it's no longer just like a two-sided fight.
Absolutely. It's funny enough about the factionalism. Yes, we were in just all that political turmoil we were in. I started writing Click after the uprising here in Minneapolis. I live in South Minneapolis. I'm a mile and a half from George Floyd Square.
Oh my!
And a lot of that, I think part of me was trying to work some stuff out through the book, because I remember I'm a big night person. I if I don't have a thing going on, I could be nocturnal, and that's my default. And that was my kind of job that week, just staying upstairs, watching, making sure no Proud Boy or Boogaloo Boy was trying to burn down the building at the park down the street. Shouting, we had to shout people off the street before. It was. Now I know the difference between a gunshot and a firework and sound like, just from. All right, that was a gunshot. That was a firework.
Yeah, I learned that lesson earlier in life, but that's just growing up in a not so, in a neighborhood that may not be the best, and it's I remember I was in LA one time, and I was sitting next to a guy out there, and this was on July 4th, and he was talking about how he didn't like fireworks, and everybody else was kind of like, what? How can you not like fireworks? And I was like, and I kind of just chimed in because I was like, yeah, because you didn't grow up in a neighborhood where there was regular gunshots. Mm-hmm. And this dude like, oh, you grew up in the ghetto. And I was like, well, I'm ghetto adjacent, but it's like, you understand, like, I get that, where it's suddenly like you hear that noise and you actually get good at distinguishing like what's a firework, what's a car backfiring, or what's like an actual gunshot. And that is definitely a thing, unfortunately, that like you guys in Minneapolis in particular.
Yeah, and one thing that really stuck out to me, and I've definitely used the description in the book, is the one day, it was right after the 3rd precinct burned down, and I walked outside and I just smelled the plasticky, smoky smell, and it really hits you. Like, that's a smell I've never smelled before, but it was so pungent and so just off. Like, you breathed it in, you're like, I should not be breathing this thing in.
It's a very particular smell.
It's very unique. It's very strong and sickly in a way. And on top of it all, I think that, Naya, one of her big problems is that a lot of times she feels like she's a coward. And when you're there in Minneapolis and you're not, during that time, and you're not protesting down on Lake Street in front of the 3rd precinct because, it's during COVID, I have a bad knee. I had a bad knee. I've got it fixed. We had a neighbor that was 101 at the time. So we were all, we decided to stay close to home. But you watch all this thing happening, it's happening real time online, and you really feel, man, I'm a coward. I'm not out there. I'm not, fighting the good fight. I'm hunkered down here. And that really, there was some autobiographical stuff going into the book, trying to work some stuff out.
I completely I feel that, because, like we were just talking about neighborhoods being bad, and, there's gunshots here in Atlanta a lot, and, shootings at the mall on a fairly regular basis. And so it's like knowing that that could happen anywhere at any time in where you live, and then going, oh, well, it's probably even more likely at a mass event where some person who doesn't agree with your ideology is going to come down and, and they were shooting. I remember that like a couple journalists got shot with rubber bullets pretty close up too during that time. And it's scary. Not to mention, like you said, that was the summer of 2020. Everyone was still scared of getting COVID. Mm-hmm. Like we weren't vaccinated yet. We weren't prepared yet to face that. So I'm with you. Like, I felt the same way. I didn't want to get COVID, and I didn't want to get shot. And then you feel bad because you're like, but everyone's out there protesting this thing that's terrible. We know it is, right? But
I think that's why it kind of like, I was reading the book. I'm trying not to get like COVID PTSD just because of all that. It definitely, I think you did a good job of channeling just that that anxiety that I mean, I know, like, sounds like you had it. I know, Billy, like we talked about, just with everything going on, like that kind of where you feel like you're constantly having to weigh one big decision against another, where it's like, okay, do I go outside and protest this thing that I feel really strongly about and risk getting COVID, and then therefore accidentally maybe giving it to some other people who, especially in that situation, because then, like, it's kind of like, and then they infect two people, and those people infect two people, and then you might end up giving it to someone who can't handle it and won't get over it, and but then of course, then there's like and then of course it's 2020, so it's an election year and a really, when a really fraught, political landscape.
And that was a shit show itself.
Oh yeah, that alone would have been enough. But then you throw COVID and the protest. Even if you support the protest, you're still like, this is like, you go out, especially like in a place like, I'm sure, I know Minneapolis has their share of kind of like hunters, and probably no shortage of people who own guns.
Oh yeah,
who, if they chose to, same just like in Georgia, if someone comes down there and starts popping off shots, what are you going to do? Especially in a big crowd.
In Minneapolis, it wasn't so much about the people from Minneapolis, because Minneapolis is a fairly whatever city. It's pretty calm and Minnesotan. But there were people from out of state coming in big pickup trucks, out of state plates. There were so many reports of them like putting stacks of bricks in random places, or just random things that could be used as weapons, and like keep an eye out on your property for anything suspicious, because there were so many reports of people from out of state causing trouble on purpose.
Yeah, one of the things we were told, kind of by the neighborhood association, was after, in the daytime, go through the alley and see if there's any explosive stuff. Yeah, because people would have these gas canisters and just stuff ready to set on fire and throw at a house to burn it down, because these freaking, we had domestic terrorists running around.
Yeah.
So it was a crap time. It was just a real crap time for everyone.
I agree. So during all of that, then was it cathartic to write during that time then? Or, I mean, how did you find the space, the time, whatever, to write? I mean, obviously you said nobody was doing anything else, right? But still, a lot of people found it hard to create during that time because they felt so much anxiety, or they felt, that they were just in survival mode. So I'm curious how that was different for you.
Right. I think what happened during COVID is, as soon as I was on tour with the National Theater for Children in Northern Ohio, on Thursday the 12th, and then Friday the 13th. That day, we were in Toledo, Ohio, my tour partner and I, and the governor of Ohio closed down the state, and we were going to go to Maryland. They closed down the state. So we were so nervous. We drove 14 hours straight through from Toledo to Minneapolis. And what happened I realized a lot of the creatives I knew, they fell into either two categories. It was, we're all stuck in a thing. Let's try to make as much work as possible. Let's try to, readjust. And I was not part of that. I was definitely in the category where, all right, the stuff I had lined up is gone. I'm not going to this improv fest. I'm not going to be going. This contract I have with the theater company is probably not going to pan out. I'm just going to mourn for a bit. And then after a while, it seemed those people at the very front that were trying to get all the work done, they burned themselves out. And the rest of us who were in mourning, we kind of took that momentum like, okay, now I got to create something because now I'm getting buggy here. And that was me. I was definitely one of the later creators in the COVID sphere. And as time went on, when things started to generally open back up a bit, when we were still masking and all that, I got a couple of temp jobs here and there where I got to just be alone in a room, and I'd be doing something like scanning microfiche, and then I'd have an idea. I'm like, oh, let me just write that down. And then I'd go home and I'd write.
So how do you pull, like, I mean, cause it's interesting you mentioned like the whole idea of like mourning, because like there was so much, just as a society we lost all the work, the opportunities to, you know, unless you were just being an asshole and out there partying. Like, yeah, we had some people in our neighborhood, I swear, they're throwing a party like every other week, like just out there living their best life. I'm just like, I hope the people around y'all are nice and healthy, because otherwise y'all might be about to have a bad time. And there's of course lots of kids out there too, so
Right.
but no, the idea of like mourning, but it's kind of going, we've talked about like going through troughs on this show. And like, so when you go into that, how do you come back out of it? Because I know, and I'm sure maybe all of you do, like with people who went in there and then had, and couldn't just come back out of it and start creating. They got in there and they stayed in there until, you know, maybe the whole thing was over. And then some of them are still climbing out.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like some people just decided, you know what, I'm just done, which is fine, because I know several people that were just, you know, this theater isn't doing it for me anymore. Dancing isn't doing it for me anymore. And coming to that realization, it's great. Me getting out of that trough is more instinct than anything. I've definitely been through my share of troughs. And I cannot tell you how many times I'm like, all right, I'm done with everything. I'm just gonna, and then all of a sudden it's just like it's a drug. It pulls you back in. Once I think I was out, they pull me back in. To quote Godfather 3. It was just a natural inclination that I need to create something. I need to put something on paper. I need to put something into the world. And that was me, and this book especially helped me out a lot. And it took me 6 months to write the thing. And then I put it down for a couple months, and then I was like, okay, now I got to edit it. And it took me 6 months to edit the book. And yeah, and then finally when I was done with it, I put it out in the world, and I was like, okay, whew, that was a ride. So a year from beginning to end of the process.
But that doesn't even feel, I mean, I know it's a long time, but it also doesn't feel like that long to write a book. Like, there's authors who spend 10 years writing one book. So I guess I'm curious, a lot of people let the idea of what's going to happen after stop them. So with you, and was there ever a point when you were writing this that you were like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this afterward? Or did you kind of always know what to do with it afterward?
I was just going to put it in the world and see what the reaction was. It was a story I wanted to tell. And I do have ideas for sequels. And for stories within that world. And I definitely just wanted to get that base story out first, meet Naya, be in this environment. And I never really was worried about keeping this going for too long. I don't ever see myself working 10 years on a book, just because if I'm going to do something, I'm going to plow through. NaNoWriMo was a really big help in coming over any sort of writer's block, because you got 50,000 words to write in a month. You just gotta. It might be bullshit that you put on the page, but just put some bullshit in there and you fix it later.
Well, yeah, that's a big thing. A lot of people they can't give themselves license, to put the bullshit on the page first, because like if you don't have anything out there, you don't have anything to fix and work on. But unfortunately, that's such a big hump for most people to get over. I'm noticing you've got like a lot of, looking at your website, you've got a lot of experience with all these different theaters and different productions. Do you feel like that stuff like that, having been through that process, helps you when you're getting, writing the book? Because just that, I mean, it's interesting, even though it's a very, two different, technically, I guess, two different art forms, writing versus theater. But is that thing of theater when, when you're putting that show together, there's so much you have to work out and stuff that you may have, you try it, it might be awful. You have to disregard it and then find something else.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that process, having been through that, helped when it came time to write the novel?
A lot. It really helped a lot, especially with dialogue, because you read a script, the entire thing's dialogue, except for the stage directions. But I digress. You just talking like a normal human being and throwing in different phrases and words, that's easy for me. The stuff that I had to learn was the syntax and the grammar stuff, because as you could tell, I have an accent and I speak I speak like a dock worker from the 1950s. That's my slang. That's the lingo I use. And so, being grammatically correct and having to go back and be like, all right, how do I line this up? How do I make this clear? And that's why I had 3 alpha readers helping me out with that. I would also say that with theater, you spend so much time in creating a character and getting into their mindset. And which characters are interesting. Which characters are boring. And I love writing villains. Absolutely do. Because the villain never thinks they're the villain. They always think they're right.
Villain is always the hero of their own story.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're willing to do shady stuff about it. And I find those type of characters fascinating. No one wants to... you guys heard of the Mary Sue, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So a Mary Sue is it's a term for a character that's just perfect and strong, and there's nothing really wrong with this character. Which
I would say if I know, Billy, you're not a big Star Wars fan, but if you want a good example of that, go watch the sequel trilogy. Mm-hmm. I feel like what they did to Daisy Ridley's character Rey, she started out with a lot in that first movie. There was a lot of, you didn't know everything about her, but there was a lot of interesting stuff. She was, they had set up a lot. And part of why I got so pissed off with the rest of the trilogy is because I feel like they just kind of was like, okay, let's just make her the most awesome person ever. No hero's journey, nothing. There's nothing dynamic about her story. It's like, she's just awesome. It's like it's like no thought in, learning. And I was trying to say there's been lots of female characters out there who are well written. Like you go look at like Ridley in Aliens, whereas like in the first movie, like she's she's like the person in the crew that like nobody likes. And she's kind of the one that's having to quote rules to everybody and they're all pissed off at her. But like it's, the trope of like, the old joke, if you've seen it online, it's like, the one time like the woman is telling everybody this thing and nobody listens and they all die. And then you kind of watch her grow from being like that person who's just kind of like the blue collar worker, just trying to enforce the rules, to the second movie where now it's like, she has to learn how to fight and like get in there with these like Marines. And it's like, that's an arc though. That character's having to grow to being forced into change. And it's kind of like what you say, like the Mary Sue is where it's kind of like a flat female character, just kind of thrown out there for the sake of being thrown out there.
It can even be a flat male character. Like,
and say that then I don't know what you would call like it had to be a different term, but yeah, there's plenty of flat male characters out there. So it's not something that's relegated just to female characters. There's plenty of shitty writing out there and lots of bad characters.
Well, people accuse Superman sometimes of being a Mary Sue. Like certain stories of Superman, where he's just like, oh, he's perfect. So
the big blue Boy Scout. That's always the kind of the knock. Like he's just It's like someone was joking, like, "Oh, what's Superman going to do? The right thing." You know, it's like you never have to ask like what. It's not like he's, he does the why. I think why so many people gravitate towards Batman is because Batman is kind of shady and doing like, it's like, real, should he really be doing that? It's like Bruce Wayne could be donating a lot of money to charity.
He's a more complicated character, but it's interesting that you chose Ripley as your example, because Ripley was written unisex. So, you know,
actually, in the original Alien, all of them were originally written that way. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
I had been in a screenwriting class, and my teacher like brought up the fact that everybody in that class who was male wrote their women the same friggin' way. Like, you know, she was always between 20 and 25. She was always hot. They always described her body and what her hair color was, because that was important. Like, it was always that and nothing else. There was nothing about this person and their complexities, and all the men were written very differently. And so, you know, that's just to say that I
at
think
some point, does the woman go, "Oh God, what are we gonna do?"
No, I just think the Mary Sue concept might kind of come out of that. Really, a lot of times,
I'm afraid there's probably a lot of that where it's just, and it may be like male writers who don't know how to write female characters. They just, again, it's just like, I remember Reese Witherspoon. I saw her giving a speech one time. It's like part of why she got into producing and writing and all this stuff is because she kept getting these scripts where it's like the woman who goes, "Oh my God, what are we gonna do?" It's like, she's like, "I have never heard a woman utter that phrase in my entire life." And I was just thinking, like, yeah, come to think of it, yeah, neither have I. Like, not the women I've known.
Yeah,
I made a big effort in the book not to have that be Naya or any of the other female characters in the novel, because I definitely wanted to hit the Bechdel test big time. And I also can't stand it. It's one of the things that irritates me. You have one of my biggest irritations. You have characters that have abilities, and they hem and haw whether or not they're going to do something that they've already done thousands of times before. Like, yeah, she's feeling kind of iffy about doing this smuggling run, right? But she's still going to do it. She's going to see out the contract. She's on the board. She's going to do it. And which one of the biggest fucking things that bothers me so much is, say that you're in a video game and you spend the entire thing killing all these nameless mooks, and you finally get to the villain and you got the gun against their head and it gives you the choice: kill, don't kill. What about those other hundreds of guys that you just killed? What about all those innocent people that got caught in the crossfire? Oh yeah, but this is where you draw the line. This is where you're good. I mean, that sort of stuff just bothers me.
It always reminds me of the joke. Was it like if you like watching the first Clerks where they're talking about the Death Stars? Like, how many people on there were just like contract workers? They've got a nice fat government contract and they're just doing this thing to make money for their family, and then some radical left wing militants come along and just blow the whole thing up. It's like you're like, yeah, I never thought about it like that, but oh my God, it's like. But no, I think that's what makes the writing good, is when you're willing to drill down into those details that someone who's trying to maybe make certain maybe you're trying to make a hero more noble than maybe they ought to be. It's like, whereas like if you're willing to say, yeah, I'm going to allow this character a little bit of grayness. So like when you actually kind of think, well, are they doing the right thing? And just in general, like I can't think of an example where that doesn't, very few examples at least where that doesn't make the story better in general. Is that kind of like the I guess the SOP that you're working off of here? Mm-hmm. Because you also talked about like the Bechdel test, which is something, I'm sad to say I only learned about like a couple of years ago, but it's one of those, there's certain things I found, and then you can, I'd like kind of to hear like your own experience, like those certain things that have come out of just people looking like, like looking at what stuff like what Billy Joe taught, like these guys who will write the girl and she's 20 to 25 and they have to talk about her looks and probably may not have much other there just to be like a sounding board for the male characters.
Right.
Do you find that kind of stuff where you can kind of take that outside look and say, okay, I need to apply this to here, so I'm actually getting something a little more genuine, a little more real?
Well, I would say I definitely bring actively think about stuff like that. Actively think about Bechdel test. Actively bring those conceptions, because I'm a guy, and I'm not in a woman's body, and making a very cognizant effort to approach this like, all right, this is a character. I'm going to approach it like any other character I've ever played or ever written, because even though this is not my gender, we still have functioning brains and we all have goals and stuff. Just some stuff you have to adjust. And I would say for this one, this is why I kept to animal human hybrids, because animals don't have as high as a sex drive as human beings, and I really don't want to be writing about how bat people and camel people fuck. I don't, and that's why that relationship is platonic. There's really no romantic relationship in this entire thing, because I don't want to get into the details about that sort of stuff, and it does bother me when you have a female character that is portrayed as a strong female, presented as a strong female character that needs to be saved all the time instead of one doing the saving. So I'm definitely very aware of my male privilege on that, and this is why two of my alpha readers, I have two women looking over the book to help me out, be like, hey, this doesn't seem right. I'm just going, all right.
I was going to ask.
Question?
Yeah, I was going to ask. So was Natalie one of your readers? Your wife was?
Yes, she was.
She was, and what kind of input did she give you? How was she helpful in that process?
Well, she gave me a lot of great clarity work, just making things more clear grammatically. And she also adds some... Sorry, it's been kind of long since I have all her notes in a document. Questions about, making things... what's the right word? Just making them easier to digest. That's what it is. Keeping it making that pace going through the world. We have a term here, we have a word here. This is a new thing that's going on in the world. Let's not all berate this at once. You
don't want the Star Trek, like a full page of just techno jargon or them explaining,
exactly
how this particular science, and they're doing it for the audience, because I've heard there's always the joke, and whether it's it's like law shows or it's or science fiction or whatever, anytime there's a bunch of people all working the same job and then they stop and explain something, it's like, well, in real life you wouldn't do that because we all work here, and
right.
And you realize it's one of those things, you really, but there's also there's that fine line, you have to, if you're bringing an audience into a world that most people are not familiar with, you've got to balance that. How much do you just go with okay, yes, we all work here, so we all know that, but at the same time we have to let the audience do it, and then you've got to kind of make some writing choices accordingly.
Yeah, it is. That would drive me nuts.
Is that where you lean on your alpha readers to say, okay, maybe I'm not being as clear, because it's exactly, as the writer, it's all in your head. You know what you mean, but you may not be. You find sometimes it's we've talked about being willing to take feedback on this show.
And that's a huge thing for me, is I needed that feedback, and I actively sought that out. And it's so great that I got the feedback I did, because that helped the book immensely. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have places in it where it'd be just techno jargon gobbledygook about all these factions that nobody knows what it is. And having that feedback was, and I think this is where my theater experience comes in, is I'm very old school theater. I remember one time I was in a show and I was doing a scene, and my director from the back of the theater just screams out, "Boring!" And, you know, we adjusted because I was being boring. And
yeah, sorry. I was
Go ahead.
But no, it reminded me. You just reminded me. Like I had a teacher one time that like got actively pissed at me, and like we were in a playwriting class, and they basically, you know, you're just like, they call it like flash. I don't know. It's not like flash or flash drama. That was what we call it. It's basically you're practicing to write these 10-minute plays, and we got a hold of this one where the writing was so. We thought it was so over the top stereotypical that like we think, okay, me and the rest of the guys that get sent up there to do it, we think, oh, we've got a satire on our hands. And it also didn't help that our lead actor was a guy who was just kind of like, he was just one of those people who's just naturally funny.
Right.
So like he can take a joke and then just run with it till everybody's on the floor. And of course we come out there and we do the thing and we think we're doing a comedy. So we're being all big and broad, and the basic idea of the story was some guy from the city who comes along, and then all the yokels are coming out there and you know terrorizing this guy. But it's written in such a fashion, we thought it was like you're clearly satirizing this because the names were all like Bubba and you know Billy Jim, and then like the main guys like Percival Ashley Billingsworth the third, and we're like, are you? So we like, yeah, this is a joke, right? This is totally a joke. No. Our teacher was furious. She's like, this is a story about a lynching. How dare you? And she tore into us in front of the whole class. I couldn't speak to her for a week afterwards because we were even going like talking like, it's like, how did we get this wrong? And then we were talking about like, yeah, because like everybody had the same read on it. We were all like thinking like this is, but I mean, there's that thing, but I feel like, because the thing I found in theaters, like you kind of like, there are times like you got to take the note, right? But I feel like that's a big thing for writers, is because it's like, well, how come you just don't understand my brilliance? You know, like you versus like in a situation like theater or like acting or in movies, like you've got to take the note versus a thing where you can take the note or not take the note. But
right, that's such a. I think that's where having alpha readers come in handy, because. Yeah, someone might probably going to read the book and have a totally different interpretation of what it is. Someone might look at it and be like, oh, look at this XYZ. And, well, that's the reality. I mean, I try to make it as clear as I could. And if it's not, well, some people just ain't going to get it. So, I mean, I definitely, I hope no one's going to find it as severe as mistaking this for a satire about a lynching or something, but no, it's people are gonna misread stuff. People are going to get a different interpretation, which is fine. You know, it's out in the world. It's the story's there. It's there, and I don't get any more say in it until the sequel comes out or the prequel comes out, whenever that may happen. Funny thing about feedback, though, is after I announced that the thing was published, I had 2 different people come up to me and were like, hey, so I've been writing a book. Could you, like, give me some feedback on this? And I'm like, sure. And I go, yeah, sure, I'll read it. And I do, and I give feedback, and they push back at all this stuff. Well, I'm not really going for this. Well, I'm not doing this. And they're like, oh, I know what show don't tell means. And it's like, well, you do. So right now, anytime that someone asks me, like, hey, could you take a look at this? I'm kind of, can you take the feedback? Because if you're not able to take feedback in an effective manner, because these are some people that have been working on these books for 5-10 years.
Yeah.
And they just won't pull the trigger. and get it done because they want everything to be perfect. And that's just the thing. It's a book. It's not gonna be perfect. I mean, Blood Meridian, my favorite book of all time, it's not perfect.
I mean, I don't know what.
Oh,
Sorry, I just like my own little person. Like, I don't know what Cormac McCarthy has against punctuation, but that's as much as I remember reading The Road, and as much as I love that book, I'm like, dude, what do you have against commas?
right?
You know, Faulkner didn't really do punctuation either, and I have a love-hate relationship with him too. But I was gonna say, when you were talking about the idea of something being perfect, and I think that's such a healthy attitude to have towards your art, because so many people don't grow because they want everything to be perfect right now, and they won't do something if it's not perfect. And you know, my mentality, like going into karaoke, like I'm not going to go and do the same karaoke song every week because that's the one I can do really, really well, right? I'm going to go in and just throw myself in and do some off the wall, or I'm going to have somebody, you know, give me one to do, and I'm going to do it because I want to challenge myself more than I want to be perfect, right? So when you moved on to the poetry, what made you decide to do a book of poetry next after Click?
So, with the company that Billy, Joe, and I did a show called The Deep Dark with, where our little app comes from. That theater company, Oncoming Productions, they had during the pandemic a holiday-themed podcast show in which local theater artists would create things for it. And one of my first poems was in that initial one. And actually, I'm sorry, my apologies. We actually did a stage reading of this stuff at one time. It's called Oncoming Productions Ruins Christmas. And we wanted to parody we wanted to take a shot at the Christmas poem. So I took a visit from St. Christopher, a visit from St. Nicholas, and I changed it around. So it was all about a guy pushing his uncle off the roof. Making it very gory, getting that, because we lacked I saw in the rest of the show, you know, there's some great stuff, but we lacked body horror, and we didn't mention the Christmas poem. So I did 2 in 1. And so when we did that for the podcast, Blight Christmas, I was like, all right, that's pretty fun. And then they did it next year, and I parodied The Grinch, when that one was all about, it was how Big Richie killed Chris Mast.
Dr. Seuss meet David Cronenberg.
Pretty much, yes. And then the third one, that was on this the dusk of Susan's depravity, which was a Milton a poem on this the dusk of Christ's nativity. And I took that entire writing structure and I made it all about this woman brutally murdering and ripping apart this guy that's been gaslighting her. Very vivid, very detailed. Because you go extreme enough, you know, it can be kind of funny. I will never, I'm always going to be proud of myself that in the first Christmas poem I wrote, out of his back, like a yellow bidet, sprayed spinal fluid from his 4th vertebrae. I will always be proud of myself for that line.
I'm proud of you for that line. That's amazing.
I mean, you definitely should take a victory lap off of that one, or 10. You know, that's
yeah.
that's...
But I found that I have a very dark sense of humor. I have a very, very dark sense of humor, and working into those poems, not only was I able to really get creative with the gore, get creative with that humor, I was also able to hone my skills as a writer technically, because I could just, you have to follow the rhyme, you have to follow the scheme, you have to follow the the how like the rhythm and A B A B C D C D, like where the rhymes are. Like this one goes 7. This is a 7, then it goes 4, then it goes 7, and Milton does a really fascinating thing where he changes the structure, like halfway through that poem that I parodied.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found myself having to do that as well. I'm like, oh, okay, here's where we can have the shift. It's a lot more time.
Did you find that structure actually more helpful in creating the thing? Because it kind of, like, again, you have this blueprint that you can use, or like we talked about embracing the constraints on this thing, like where it's like, this is like, or like a set of train tracks, like now where you can go other than like having to navigate like something that's a little too broad.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It really helps to have a structure, to bones to put the flesh on. Because if I'm just trying to parody that's why the parody comes in so handy, that I can make it sound exactly like it does. And having those rules, you say, okay, you can look back and be like, okay, this structure worked before and was very successful in another thing. Let's take that and give it a shot. Let's see what could happen, because the rules are there to help. They're not there to hinder. Which is why there's rules in theater, rules in improv. And once in a while, it's a good idea to break those rules. There's rules in writing. Sometimes it's a good idea to break a rule or two. Or, if you're a dadaist, you just break all of them. Yeah, structure's there to help, and it's like painting. You learn how to paint the still life apple before you get into abstract expressionism. Just so you have that base, and then you can start playing with it. Because once you got a solid base, you could start really honing craft and doing very incredible things.
That's the old cliche. You got to learn the rules before you break them. But then there comes the big question is, when do you break the rules and where?
Mm-hmm.
And why, I guess, is the even more important question.
And for me, it always seems that if you're going to break the rules, it's got to mean something, instead of just being like, hey, look at me, I'm breaking the rules, I'm so cool. Yeah, you can't just be that bad boy with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth, with the skateboard. No, that's you don't want to peacock it, You got to have a significant reason why the work will be better because you break that rule.
It reminds me of one of my favorite, there's some quote, I don't know if it was a meme or whatever. It says, if you're a contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian, you're not enlightened. You're just a sheep with bad timing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Contrarianism is not as, it's small dog syndrome. Like it's why Chihuahuas and smaller dogs are always yapping, because they're not as big as a Great Dane, but they want to be seen as big as a Great Dane. So they yap and they nip at ankles.
Well, you see that a lot nowadays with certain artists, where it's like, nowadays everybody wants to be a disruptor. I'm a disruptor, and it's like, well, what are you disrupting and why? I mean, in this certain script, I was like, okay, you're clearly just trying to do something different for the sake of doing something different, but you didn't know why you were doing it. And it becomes, and the more you watch the thing, whatever it is, it becomes painfully obvious, like past a certain point.
Yeah. And if you got something to say, just say it, If you put it in your work in a way that can be conveyed effectively. Because a lot of times people get, I was in a social justice theater troupe for a while. And after a while, we found our audiences, which was on this college campus, and ourselves, getting very, worn down with what we were saying, because it was all very just blatantly obvious. Like, this is here's our values, here's our things, and we really just was so upfront with it that it really, I believe, took away from the message. Instead of having a story about like someone going through this thing, about like an injustice. You know, we're all like here with, I don't know. It was.
Well, do you find that like just good storytelling in general just tends to trend? Like, even if I agree with your politics, I've seen movies like, yeah, I know, like normally I would, you know, it's like, yeah, I see what you're going for. I agree with it, but you made a shitty movie. So I'm not just going to sit here and lap it up. Like, you know, like if you serve me, like even if I go to, it's like, okay, I want a steak, but if you serve me some like this half cooked, like no seasoning, like, or maybe you boiled the steak, whatever, just for the, you know, it's like, even if if I'm supposed to like what you're feeding me, I'm not going to lap it up just because it's bad and I'm sympathetic. You know, it's kind of like, you've still got to make the thing interesting.
Well, it goes back to the Mary Sue syndrome, doesn't it? That, like, you know, if you're making this idea thing, this play, whatever it is that you're making, from this standpoint that none of this is complicated and that these issues are just cut and dry, clear, you know, right, wrong, right? Which is not the case, right? Like, even what we were talking about before with the protesting is like, is it right that Rob and I didn't protest? Or is it complicated, right? That, you know, people's lives are not binary, right? And so I was going back to the idea, like, there's plays that present issues in a way that's very powerful, often because they're not presented as a binary black or white sort of thing. The one that stands out to me in my head is always All Our Sons by Arthur Miller. Do you guys know that one?
I'm not familiar with that. It's been a while. But...
So there's like a family secret that somebody was a war profiteer, and the thing is that their son died, but it was because of the father's faulty parts that he was selling for the war. And so it's like it becomes this very gray area of, well, the father did wrong, but he's paying for it because he basically killed his own son. I mean, that these things are never cut and dry, right?
It's kind of the old set was some quotes like, even the wicked get worse than they deserve, and it's kind of one of those things like you see it done in a play where even where you're inclined to want to watch this person get it, but they get it so bad to the point where you're like, oh man, this is, you know, it's suddenly that but it's kind of if it's done well, it can be a good kind of dramatic thing, because now. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on this, Rob. Like, where you see where the person, we're suddenly now watching the person that you wanted to see get their comeuppance, get it in such a way that it kind of takes the joy out of it dramatically. Like stuff like that, where you find, like, again, talking about like breaking the rules, like where this is the part where this thing is supposed to happen, and now you have to make a conscious choice to say, okay, here's where the twist comes in, or here's where I'm going to break this rule. But it is for a very specific effect, not just for the sake of doing it. Is that kind of like a guidepost that you would use in your own writing? Or
I would say, if you're going to break the rule, it really has to mean something, like the comeuppance, or what's going to happen with the world itself, or happen with the main character itself. Like, we kind of see where it's going, and is it going to go there? I know I talk pretty abstractly, try not to spoil the book. There definitely are some like little twists in there about people she meets, Gibbard she meets, and what actually happens to her. But going back to that, presenting the product as something good, you know, good work stands on its own 2 feet. And you don't need blatant, like, yeah, here's my politics. You agree with me, right? No, just if you, I'm very big about you don't put shit on stage. If I'm going to put work, it's not going to be crap. It's going to be good. Or, you know, in my opinion, good. And I find it very, things that are really trying to be so disruptors and be so trying to derail what all this work you've been building for, I find that incredibly distracting. I find it incredibly it's a letdown. I hope that answered your question in some respect. I'm not sure if it did or not.
Like, I mean, does it also like think, and I don't know, maybe I'm curious what your thoughts like. It's almost like a form. It's lazy art sometimes.
Oh, it's
just
so
like
lazy.
It's like, and you know, just my own. Yeah, I'm probably gonna get some shit on this one. But like, you remember like the some of the Mapplethorpe stuff back in the day. Like I remember seeing, I was in an art class, and there's like the thing of the piss Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
The crucifix in a big thing of urine. I'm like, I get it if you've got issues with religion, but I'm like, literally anybody could do this. Like, I mean, I feel like I'm just looking at this and like everyone's supposed to be telling me this is brilliant. I'm like, this is just lazy art. It's like anybody can go buy a crucifix, drop it in a pan, piss in it, and take a picture. I feel like you've done like or like, you know, someone like we taught someone like found art. Like I'm just going to go grab this thing off the street, put it on a pedestal, and you know, it's just like that idea that like people are always looking for it's just like looking for shortcuts in art, right?
I feel I disagree with the Mapplethorpe for the
I mean, yeah, it's subjective.
Of,
so if you disagree with me,
but I mean that makes sense. For me, the timing works out though. Like at that time, there really wasn't someone doing that.
Yeah.
At that time. Which is why, but if someone were to do it right now, you know, it's just like,
and I think part of it for me is like I saw it too many years after, so it didn't have it. Yeah, the context of it didn't hit the way it, you know, the way it would have when he first did it.
That's exactly. I agree with Rob because like I go to say the Walker Art Museum and you see there's the 3 canvases, one red, one yellow, one blue, right? And I'm like, I remember the first time I saw them when I was in college, and I was like, how is this art? I could do that. Like, anybody could do that. But it is like, it was of the time, right? So it was breaking the rules that came before it. But yeah, now if you did it, and people would be like, great, why should I pay you that much money for that? Right?
Well, I guess like Andy Warhol too, like, because you look at some of his stuff now and you're just like, what? This looks like half the fucking t-shirts I see in the store.
Right.
You know, but at the time it was like it was like revolutionary. And
right.
I was like, I like Warhol, but I can understand when people look at that and just go, God, what's the point of this?
Mm-hmm.
So I've spent several times going to modern art museums and I look at things. I'm like, why? Like I went to the Dublin Art Museum and they had this piece called Cocoon. I mean, granted that like this, and it looked just like a giant turd hanging from the ceiling. And it's like, don't pull it's a turd. Don't call this Cocoon. You just there's nothing to be really said about a giant piece of crap. And I'm, you know, looking at it all through these things and I'm like, okay, maybe I don't get it. Maybe maybe I'm not understanding it correct, but there's nothing really significant to me about having what looks like to be a giant piece of shit hanging from the ceiling. But again, maybe at a different time period, that would have made a lot of sense. That would have been more impactful. And on the flip side, you know, people trying to redo things like, for example, invisible theater, where you don't make invisible theater, for those that don't know, listeners, it's where there was that show where it was these people acting out like an event, like someone being discriminatory towards someone else, or someone breaking into a car and seeing what other people do, being it all staged, just trying to get everyone to react to it. that was a big thing back in the 60s, 70s when that stuff started coming out. But now we got social media. We don't need to like have people on the street acting out like for example, if Billy Joe and I were to act out like me being like really a chauvinistic pig to her or something. You know, we don't need that. We experience that every fucking day. We don't need that anymore. Because we see it all the time, and people have an understanding of what to do. Also, I feel it very unfair to put that emphasis on unwilling audience members. I feel it very unfair to put that stress onto them because you don't know what's going on in their life.
Yeah.
Right.
And on the contrary, you know, you look at some of these idiot comedians that were used to be all like doing all this, like, oh, you know, oh, it's all woke nowadays, and you know, I can't make jokes about, you know, you can't punch down anymore, so your entire repertoire is gone, which means you're a shitty comedian. That's for sure. It's just like the timing. You know, yeah, sure. Well, back then that was breaking the rules. That might have got you some laughs, but now, you know, it ain't effective no more.
Well, I do think like if a third, if not half of art is just context.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we tend to like, there's certain pieces of art that we'll revere as great because they can kind of transcend the time they were in. So, I mean, that's my treatise.
No, I think that's totally true.
I agree.
I was going to say, like, sometimes you see a certain piece of art at a certain time of your life, and it's, like, mind-blowing to you at that time in your life. Like, for instance, when I was younger, I loved Salvador Dali, and now I look at Salvador Dali, and I'm like, it's a little too dark for me now. Like, I don't appreciate it the same way I did as when I was a teenager, somehow, you know? Or there's books that you go, oh, I loved this book. I read it a bunch of times when I was a teen, and now I'm an adult and I want to revisit it. And you go, what did I see in that? Like, what was that about? Well, we are well past our hour, so we should probably wrap it up. But this has been awesome. I'll just do the honors. Rob, where can people find you? Where can people find your book or your work if they want to seek you out?
Sure thing. My website is robwardcreative.com. My book, Click, and my book of poetry, Apex of Christmas Strife, are both available on Amazon for print. You can also find Click on barnesandnobles.com and Apple Books. Yeah, and if you ever want to get in contact with me, there is a contact sheet on robwardcreative.com. So if you want to talk to me about how I just totally dissed your comedy stylings that you can't punch down anymore, come meet me outside.
Catch me outside.
Catch me outside.
Rob's from Chicago. I wouldn't try it.
That will be all for this episode. To keep up with the show, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ScratchClawPush. If social media isn't your thing, you can contact us at scratchclawpush@gmail.com. This podcast has been a Carcutta Media production. For a full list of our podcasts, go to carcuttamedia.com/podcasts. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for use of brief quotations and review. Copyright 2023 by Carcutta Media, LLC. All rights reserved.